Hey guys, it's Danny. Today I am taking you along as I'm doing a little bit of maintenance on some of my orchids. Some don't necessarily need maintenance, but there are things that I want to do. And because this is a more practical, let's say, approach to the hobby, a little bit different than what we talk in tutorials, I think it's important to see these things as well, because not many tutorials, not even my tutorials, talk about it. It's pretty much your day-to-day routine with orchids, when sometimes you might want to change something, you might want to intervene and adjust or improve something. And I do have a few orchids to talk to you about that have some either dead pseudobulbs, either some unnecessary structures, some yellowing leaves that I do want to get rid of, how I go about it, and when I decide against intervening. So I hope you enjoyed this video and this more personal approach. And with that said, let's get on with, I think, some orchids which could use a little haircut. Okay, so here I have my Miltonia spectabilis variety Morelliana. I received this one from Veronica in December, I think. And as you can see, she's doing pretty well. I have quite a lot of new growth developing nicely here. I'm very excited to see this one in bloom because the color is spectacular. Even though purple, in pictures it looks amazing. But if you take a closer look, we can see that we have some issues with some very old pseudobulbs. Now, I know they're old because the direction of growth of this orchid is this way. So this is the newest growth. And here in the back, opposite to the new growth, is the oldest growth. So these are pretty old pseudobulbs here, which, as you can see, are yellow and need removing. Now, this sort of stuff can happen with sympodial orchids. The older the growth or the structure, the more prone it is to have some issues. So to some extent, the orchid kind of regenerates itself as well. So something like this is really not something concerning, but it really doesn't look good. And of course, since most of us grow orchids in our homes, having breaking down organic material in the pot is not a good idea. It will attract pathogens. So I have my trusty fiskars here. I disinfected it. So first I want to tackle this very old pseudobulb, which you can see is already dried. And what I'm gonna do is try to pull on it while keeping the rhizome down and see if I can remove it this way. And here we go. Usually when you have a pseudobulb reach this stage, it's easy to just pull it out. You don't necessarily need to cut anything, but with this one, we cannot perform the same trick. So what I will do is use my fiskars and cut the rhizome close to the healthy pseudobulb. So let's give it a clean cut. And that made more noise than it should have because I was touching the metal container. And if we take a look at the rhizome, we can see that it's completely dry. There is no chance that we missed out on potential growth in this area because it's absolutely gone. We can see that we did have a little nub trying to form here, but it's dried, it's gone. Nothing would have grown from here. This rhizome now doesn't actually need any cinnamon, any sealing, anything of the sorts because it's already dry, and dry and dead tissue cannot get infected by anything. It can break down, but that's a whole different story, and it's gonna happen in a very long time. So I believe my orchid is good to go. I don't see any other issues on it. All of the other pseudobulbs look okay, so I can return it to its place. Alrighty, next up here we have a cattleya type orchid. It's missing its tag for whatever reason, but this is the Cincorana crossed with the Boo Lady. It's a beautiful cattleya, smells wonderful, and blooms reliably for me. You can see every pseudobulb, with the exception of the oldest ones, has a flower spike dried off. That being said though, this orchid wasn't always super healthy and established. And in the beginning, when I purchased it, it went through a sort of a transition in which you can see some of the pseudobulbs really don't look all that great. I remember it to this day. This is the first pseudobulb it grew for me. And because the root system was not good on it, this growth became so soft and shriveled. And do you see these lines? This is where the tissue actually got damaged because the pseudobulb was so soft, it kind of curled. Well, the story has a happy end because this orchid currently is very healthy and has a good root system, but the oldest growths really don't look that great. Leaves don't look that great either. And I want to refresh a little bit this orchid. These growths are so uncomfortable. I always manage to snag them with my clothes. It's a nightmare. So what I will do is remove these two growths. Even though they are not yet gone, they're not yellowing necessarily, they're not shriveled, but they pose a threat to this orchid. The way we're gonna go about it is exactly like we did with the Miltonia. I will cut the rhizome, not the canes, and I will remove only this section of the orchid. I made sure that my orchid has enough pseudobulbs to be able to photosynthesize and store nutrients and feed a new growth. I also made sure that the entire orchid has a really good root system. And furthermore, I made sure that whatever roots are growing from this section of the plant are not vital roots. There's nothing growing from the back here, but there is 1 or 2 roots here that I will remove. I checked them, they're completely dry. So by me removing this section of the plant, I'm not going to damage anything. And that's a little bit of a side note. Whatever cosmetic things you want to do to your orchid, first and foremost, do make sure that you're not actually going to damage the orchid. If nothing on this orchid is vital, then you can go ahead and arrange it a little bit. But do know that sometimes we do have to give up aesthetics for the well-being of the orchid, and I'll show you one towards the end of this video. So with that said, we can go ahead. I'll go sterilize my pair of pruners and I'll show you what I will cut. Right, so the most important thing is to make sure that we're not actually going to cut vital things. So I would rather cut much closer to the division that I want to remove than further up, because if I cut here, can you see what I'm gonna do? I'm going to destroy the base of this entire pseudobulb, and I do not want that. However, if I cut to further back, I'm not gonna destroy anything vital because I want to remove these two pseudobulbs. So I would much rather cut into this pseudobulb rather than this one. So I will go exactly where this pseudobulb ends, making sure that my pruners is firm in place. Now, as I was saying, this division does have 1 or 2 roots which are not alive anymore. And at this point, you have to assess your situation a little bit. If the older section has a lot of dead roots, you might want to consider totally repotting the orchid, because having too many dead roots in the pot is not a good idea. But I did see that mine only has 2 roots inside the pot, so I will try to remove them. But if I see that they're going to really damage the other good roots, I'm just going to cut them. And there we have it. So this is the division that I cut away. We can see that the roots are completely dead, so they weren't actually feeding the orchid. And this division, well, we can try and propagate it. It may be that some of these eyes are still good, and I do see a little eye here, but being that this is a very old division, it doesn't have good roots, I don't know if it has enough energy to grow this eye to the point of actually creating roots of its own. I will put it in a little bit of sphagnum moss in a jar and see what happens, but I really doubt this very old division can be propagated. Depends on the orchid though. You can definitely try to propagate the older division. In many cases it works out. But as we can see, my remaining division is not so wonky anymore. It is a little bit slanted, that is okay. So I will try and train the new growth to grow in this direction, but at least now this orchid will not get stuck in my clothes. And since we're here, I'm going to cut away all of these old and dried flower spikes that I did not cut for all of these years. Sometimes I just cannot be bothered with these, I don't know why, and I know it doesn't look good, but yeah, there we go. Since I make videos, sometimes it's a good idea for me not to cut anything just so I can make an informative video about it. As for the cut rhizome, well, typically rhizomes don't necessarily get super easily infected, particularly because mine is well raised above the medium. It really isn't going to stay soggy. You can put a little bit of cinnamon here, but usually when you water the orchid, it just washes off. You can put a little bit of hot glue as well. I personally just let them be. Since this is a very woody formation, it's not a very soft and fleshy tissue, it's really not so prone to getting all sorts of infections. If I would cut a pseudobulb, I would definitely put a layer of cinnamon there, but with rhizomes, I personally don't do anything. Alrighty, now let's talk about some yellowing leaves. Well, there are a few scenarios. Let's take the first one, which is the best one. the bottom leaves on a monopodial orchid or the oldest leaves on a sympodial. Typically, these leaves are naturally shed by orchids. Phalaenopsis, Ingracums, Vandas, they all do it from time to time. What I don't like to do is remove them at this stage. You can see that this leaf, which by the way is on my Ingracum leonis. So as you can see, this is a very old leaf. It's shriveled, it's yellowing, but it's still very much attached to the orchid. It might not look very appealing, but if I try to remove it now, I would have to cut it. There is no other way to take it off, which means I'm opening up a door for pathogens. And even though I might apply a layer of cinnamon, my motto is don't do a cut if you don't really have to. Because if you're just a little bit patient, these leaves will detach on their own, just like this. Here's another example. This one is already almost detached. There you go. And this happens when the leaves are already dried. So I think in about 2 weeks, I will be able to do this with this leaf as well. Now, the benefit is that the orchid herself will seal this quote-unquote cut. Do we see here that there is a very straight line on both of these leaves? Well, this segment is created specifically for the purpose of making sure that the older leaves fall off safely and without actually making an open wound through which pathogens can enter. And with the exception of Paphiopedilums, surprising, I know, all of my orchids have this mechanism. Even sympodial orchids such as Oncidiums, Miltonias, and even Zygopedilums have this mechanism with all of their leaves. So let me get you in closer, see if you can spot the line. With this orchid, it's very, very visible. There are orchids which are not so evident, but can you see there is a color difference between this section and this? Also in the back here, this section and the top. Here, pretty much everywhere, and even the top of the orchid, can we see we have a ring here on top of the pseudobulb? Well, those are the seal lines. I don't really know how to call them scientifically. If I find an answer, I will put it on the screen. But this is where the leaf will naturally break off when it's completely dry. And you can see in the back here, I have older pseudobulbs which are leafless now, and we can clearly see the lines here. But as luck would have it, this particular orchid has a dried leaf here. This is not entirely normal, but this is a Bellara, which was a little bit dehydrated. I didn't have a good medium for it. Now it's in my normal mix, but it suffered a little bit from dehydration. So this leaf is not super dry just yet, but I think I will be able to, there we go. It snaps really easy from this line. And that is actually an adaptation and a defense mechanism for any orchid against the pathogens they might encounter in their natural habitat. Because sooner or later, even if in their natural habitat there is no human picking off these leaves, they will fall on their own due to wind, due to other leaves or branches just touching these orchids, due to the natural passing of time at the end of the day, and they have to snap off from a particular place on the orchid in order to avoid further damage. So personally, I really don't like to cut away leaves if I know they will snap right off in a week or two. That's why maybe sometimes you see quite a lot of yellow leaves in my collection. I know some people go ahead and cut them off, and that's okay. It's not how I do things. However, there are cases in which yellow leaves are not a good sign, and this is one of those cases. This is my Renanthera citrina, which never ever did good for me. And you can see that I do have these tips quite a lot more pale than the entirety of the orchid. And the reason for it is that this orchid suffered from a lack of roots for quite a while. Currently, she does have some roots, but it's not something to write home about. From all of my Renantheras, this one is behaving rather suspicious. Now, lack of vigorousness, these yellowing patches indicating actually a deficiency, which is understandable since it didn't have roots. These are not good sign on an orchid. They can mean anything from a genetic issue to fusarium, viruses even. But what it is for sure, it's hard to tell without proper testing, without having, let's say, a context of the history. This is an orchid that's coming from Schwerter, as you can see. It did bloom once for me, but it never excelled. In contrast with my Renathera monachica, which sits right next to it, and it outgrew it. When I purchased this one, it was a little bit tinier than the Citrina, and now look at it. So both of these orchids are treated the same way. One is excelling, one is not. I have them both for a couple of years, 3 years at this point, and judging by the entire context, not just looking at this orchid, I do believe there is something very wrong with this one. So yellowing fresher leaves is never a good sign, but the causes for that can be as easy as too much light or improper culture. Maybe your orchid needs just a little bit more water, just a little bit more fertilizer. Those are the easy fixes, but it can go all the way to having a rootless orchid or having a seriously sick orchid. Whatever the case might be, it's never a good idea to remove these leaves, because if indeed they're caused by a deficiency, they can actually return back to their green state, depending what element is missing. But yeah, in this case, I don't really know if I will ever be able to recover this orchid. It's been 3 years already, but as long as there's green, there is hope. And the last orchid we're gonna look at is my Cattleya Bertie, which sadly is not doing all that great. And it's a little frustrating because the last update from this winter on this orchid was so promising. It had flower spikes, and now all it has is crown rot. So can we see what is happening in the center of the plant? Yep, this is crown rot. The center is blackened, the leaves are dry, and the overall orchid simply doesn't look all that great. Luckily for me, I did discover a brand new growth right here. Let me get you in closer. There it is. So I will do my best to keep this orchid alive and regenerate it once again, because it's not a very common orchid. And this is a good way to save your orchids from crown rot or things of the sorts. If you have a Phalaenopsis, if you manage to contain the rot, then you can definitely wait for a keiki and propagate the orchid through a keiki. Down below in the description, you will have a link with my technique of containing crown rot. Sadly though, crown rot is one of those ailments which never guarantees recovery. It really depends when you see it, how big the orchid is, how strong it is, and so on and so forth. So at this point, all I can do is make sure that this orchid remains viable through its stem so that it doesn't infect the keiki. However though, what I will not do at this stage is cut away these green leaves. These guys, I will remove them, but the green leaves stay, because these are the only ones providing food for the keiki. So in this instance, unlike the first instance we saw, cosmetics are not important at all. What we need to do is save this orchid and then make sure it looks pretty. At this point, I'm not even going to remove all of these diebacks on the leaves because they appear to be sealed here. They don't advance anymore. So rather than me creating an open door for pathogens and possibly losing these leaves, I would rather not do that and look at this not so pretty orchid until I can make sure that I can save the keiki and hopefully propagate my orchid, because this is one of those that I really, really like. But that's the hobby. Sometimes the unexpected happens. Okay, just a little intervention because this part was interesting. So I pulled out the top leaves, which were dry, and I saw that at the bottom of them, in the crown practically, there was active mold, which is never a good sign, and you need to get rid of it because it will continue to affect the crown. So my infection was still active. So I sprayed hydrogen peroxide 3% directly in the crown. I let it fizz for a minute or two, and then I removed it with some paper towels. Being that the crown is actually very, very deep on this orchid, I had to shape a little bit the napkin so that I can reach down into the funnel and make sure that every bit of water or hydrogen peroxide is absorbed, because after the initial reaction, all there will be left is water. and that will serve again as breeding ground for pathogens, molds, bacteria, and all of that fun stuff. So we don't want any water at all in the crown. And what I did next was put quite a glorious amount of ground cinnamon in the crown as well, because I want to make sure there is no water going inside. Also, cinnamon has a really good tendency to form a little bit of a crust when it comes in contact with water. Initially, it repels it, but then since cinnamon is bark, it soaks it up and becomes a hard crust, which I'll show you in a different video with other orchids. So I want there to be a good seal in the crown, and hopefully this is enough to stop the infection from advancing downwards or inviting other pathogens in the crown and having a party. And that's about it for today. Things are getting kind of noisy outside. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this was interesting. I hope you learned something new. And let me know if you guys like these maintenance, let's say, episodes from time to time. There's always something to do in the greenhouse. And with this occasion, maybe I will finally be on top of removing the yellow leaves on my orchids. So let me know in a comment what you think about these types of videos. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!